Hey guys, in this video we're going to look at the strengths of a fixed exchange rate. Now, as we know, the exchange rate can be fixed or floating, and some countries such as China have fixed their exchange rate. So in particular, the Chinese have fixed their exchange rate against the US dollar. So the value of the Chinese yuan in terms of the US dollar is constant throughout the financial year. And so how the government actually does this is that they actually become a net buyer or seller of the Chinese yuan in order to manipulate its market price. So we've looked at this idea of a fixed exchange rate that can either be undervalued or overvalued in our lecture, specifically designed on the fixed exchange rate. So if you want to remind yourself or refresh your memories on the fixed exchange rate and how the government uses policy to determine the exchange rate, I'd encourage you to look at that lecture. But this video we're going to look at the advantages or the arguments for fixing an exchange rate against the currency. Yeah, so the cases for the government to fix the exchange rate are as follows. So firstly, we have this concept that it eliminates uncertainty in international transactions. Okay, so what this means is that when the Chinese sell to the US government or to US consumers, firstly the US consumers will have to exchange the US dollar in terms of the Chinese yuan, because the US dollar is not accepted as a readily available form of payment in China. They only accept yuan, and so the US people would have to first exchange their dollar in terms of the yuan. That exchange rate should be determined by market forces if the dollar was floated against the yuan. However, the yuan at the moment is fixed against the US dollar. So what that means is that the value of the yuan is constant in terms of the US dollar. And so how does that eliminate uncertainty in international transactions is that it avoids unexpected price changes. So say for example the exchange rate is 1 to 5. So 1 US dollar equals 5 yuan. Say for example the exchange rate actually appreciates from 1 US dollar to 6 yuan. So a $100 shirt in the USA would actually increase from 500 yuan to 600 yuan. And this discourages spending now because unexpected capital gains and capital losses in this case would occur. So people would then have to speculate as to when the yuan was at the lowest or the highest value before they start making these international transactions. So if the exchange rate was actually fixed, this means if it was fixed at say 5 yuan to $1, that means that those people would have certainty as to the price of the yuan to the dollar, and therefore if they wanted to buy a shirt, they wouldn't want to wait say 10 days to see whether the yuan actually appreciates to say 4 yuan to $1. They wouldn't have to worry about the yuan actually depreciating from 5 yuan to 6 yuan for every dollar. They would actually just buy it now here. So that is a benefit of having a fixed exchange rate, is that it facilitates international transactions. And this is very positive for international trade because it assists in promoting the economic growth necessary to develop. So as we know, exports prove a very large part of the economy, and if people start trading more due to this lack of uncertainty, or this elimination of uncertainty in international transactions due to the fixed dollar, then this may facilitate growth in new industries. So that's the first benefit of having a fixed exchange rate. Now the second benefit is that it avoids inflation due to the depreciation of the dollar. So as we know, imports are both included in the CPI as final let's make that a little bit clearer, sorry guys, final goods, and they're also included as inputs to businesses. And so it affects both demand inflation and cost inflation. So when the dollar depreciates, it makes imports more expensive, and therefore the CPI will increase, as well as the producer price index on intermediate goods and services. And so overall inflation will increase when the dollar depreciates. So with a fixed exchange rate, it avoids this possibility of inflation occurring due to the depreciation of the dollar, because the dollar is actually fixed to a set value or set currency exchange rate. So that's the second positive of having a fixed exchange rate, is that it avoids inflation due to depreciation. The third positive is that it avoids a loss of international competitiveness due to appreciation. As we know, if we have a floating exchange rate, there are positives and there are negatives. When the dollar appreciates, that means that is a negative to our international competitiveness, because our exports are worth relatively more. Although that may be better for inflation in the form of our imports becoming cheaper, it does actually create a situation where we are less internationally competitive, and therefore our exports market is worse off. So the advantage of having a fixed exchange rate is that the government could make an exchange rate so that inflation isn't a very prevalent factor in determining depreciation, and also that the currency is not too expensive that we would lose international competitiveness. So what the government could do is it fixes the dollar or the currency to an amount to all our trading partners, so that inflation doesn't occur due to any depreciation, and that our international competitiveness is not lost due to any appreciation. So that is the third benefit of the government fixing the right exchange rate, so that none of these problems, inflation or a loss of international competitiveness, occurs. And so the final concept, or the final advantage of having a fixed exchange rate, is that it imposes greater accountability on the government. So it imposes greater accountability to the government. So what this suggests is that since the government is actually undertaking, or this notion of a fixed exchange rate, they're actually using their policies in order to fix their exchange rate to another currency. A depreciation in particular of the exchange rate would mean that the government is not doing its job properly, and so that would maintain or ensure that the government is actually conducting its fiscal and monetary policy in a way that will maintain the exchange rate, so that they don't have this problem of facing national disgrace should the exchange rate appreciate or depreciate, in particular relative to their fixed exchange rate. So they have it imposes a greater accountability to the government, on the government. Imposes greater accountability on the government to actually conduct its policy. So they're the four main strengths of having a fixed exchange rate. Firstly, that it eliminates uncertainty in international transactions. Secondly, it avoids inflation due to depreciation of the exchange rate. Thirdly, it avoids a loss of international competitiveness due to an appreciation. And finally, it imposes greater accountability on the government to conduct its policy in a way that inflation and international competitiveness are maintained.